Hello and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 14th Sunday after Pentecost, when our scripture reading is written in the 32nd chapter of the book of Exodus, verses 7 through 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They've been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They've cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now you let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation." But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that this God brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord had a change of heart about the disaster planned against God's people." Word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This lesson near the end of the book of Exodus happens to fall in the year 2022 on the Sunday that is the final day of the United States Open tennis tournament in New York City. But oh my goodness, that tennis tournament and the people playing in it have nothing compared to this tennis match. Moses and God. Serve, volley, block, passing shot, overhead slam, down the line return, and all over this people, Israel. There they are in the wilderness at Mount Sinai. And Moses has been delayed, it says at the beginning of the chapter. So Aaron, Moses' brother, leads the people in fashioning a calf statue out of the gold jewelry that they have brought with them out of Egypt. And they indeed bow and worship that calf. As Aaron says, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And God turns to Moses and says, "This is your people. Let me at them, and I will make of you a great nation." But Moses counters, "Oh Lord, these are your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt. You claimed them. And now, if I may say so, your reputation rests on their well-being. What would the Egyptians say about you if this people had been rescued from slavery in Egypt only to die in the wilderness?" And amazingly, God had a change of heart. How much there is here that we can draw from this brief, dramatic dialogue. It's part of a long series of dialogues between Moses and God in chapters 32 to 34 of Exodus. And just in these brief 8 verses, what a remarkable amount of insight or lesson we can draw from the story. Perhaps always pray God can relent, have a change of heart, and reverse God's own plans. Or perhaps trust in God's commitments. That, after all, is what Moses appealed to. Lord, you promised this land to the ancestors and to their descendants in perpetuity. You promised to make them a great nation, as many as the stars of heaven. Lord, when you have made that commitment, how can you now destroy them with no descendants here in the wilderness? Perhaps choose community over oneself. God, after all, offers Moses the opportunity to become the ancestor of a great nation. That is not who Moses ever was or ever is. It is Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, who are remembered as the ancestors, that core family from which Israel descended. Moses was a prophet, a servant of the Lord, called from among those in slavery in Egypt to lead the people. But now God says, let me destroy them and I will make you a great nation. But Moses steps back and says, they're your people, God. I don't really have a place in this or in what you're about to do. Moses chooses the community over the potential for his own advancement and glory. Those are some of the things that we might draw as sort of morals of the story, the morality of what we might learn from this exchange, this episode. And yet there's something even deeper and more central, I think. You see, this is a story that is written into the book of Exodus and told much later than the events that it recounts. We know this in part because of that odd phrasing that Aaron says to the people, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And yet there at the wilderness in Sinai, there's only one calf. Who is this these of whom he speaks? Now, if we follow the story into the history told in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 12, verse 28, we see that the rebel king Jeroboam, who tears the northern tribes away from the southern tribes, dividing the kingdom of David and Solomon that had been won under God with the temple in Jerusalem, is Jeroboam, who forms molten calves, erects them as statues in the sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan, and says to the people, these are your gods, O Israel. The 2 calves, one in Bethel, one in Dan, these are the places now where the northern Israelites go to worship rather than God's temple in Jerusalem. And that story about Jeroboam is told even later than his day by people a century or 2 later, looking back on Israel's history. For them, for the ones who tell this story, this pattern of abandoning God, of turning to other gods, to physical idols that are not gods. This is a long and persistent story in Israel's history. It happened at Mount Sinai. It happened when Jeroboam split God's kingdom in two and took 10 tribes off to the north, worshiping in other sanctuaries. And we might imagine that it was in danger of happening in the days of those who told and wrote this story. They are looking back to these earlier episodes to see themselves in the mirror of an earlier time. And what do they see? They see a people who have been rescued by God from slavery to any other power. A people who have been called to live as God's people faithfully in the world. And a people who grow weary of that calling, weary of that responsibility, and who ultimately fail in it as they serve other ends, other purposes, other values than God, be it in the wilderness or in the land as the kingdom is divided. They fail, and yet this story tells them God will not fail. God will continue to walk with the people through the wilderness, even into the northern kingdom and its exile, and the southern kingdom's later exile. God will walk with the people faithfully, even through their betrayal of God. That faithfulness on God's part, that promise, that proven pattern of God's commitment to stay with the people is one that Israel sees in this story and those others, that shaped Jesus' own self-understanding as a Jew of his day, learning these stories as he grew and reflected on who God was, and carrying him through difficult times, suffering, betrayal, and ultimately death. God stays with us. It was true for Israel. It was true for Jesus. And whatever we face, even our own betrayal of God, it will be true for us. God bless.